Now we've looked at the outline of a typical project finance legal structure, let's zoom in on the project loan agreement now. This agreement is central to the financing structure and it brings together most of the creativity that has gone into the development of project finance. The project loan is called a facilities agreement, which may seem like a strange name in this context. A facility is normally the name we give to a room that is provided for a specific purpose, for example, a facility room. The name signals that the project loan facility can be used only for very specific purposes. The use of the borrowed funds is highly scripted in project finance. The funds you borrow must be spent on costs that are defined in other project documents. We call that utilizing or drawing down the loan. For example, the EPC agreement may define that the project company must pay a tranche of 15% of the contract sum as soon as the foundation has been completed. Then the facilities agreement will allow the SPV to draw exactly that amount by submitting the invoice from the EPC contractor and for that specific purpose. In a project finance, you often have different facilities, each destined for funding a very specific purpose. There may be an O&M facility, for example, for operations and maintenance costs. Like any loan agreement, the facilities agreement will define the amount to be borrowed, the loan term, this is the date or the various dates that the loan needs to be repaid, and the interest rate. However, in addition to these standard loan clauses, the facilities agreement will contain several very specific clauses that fit into the project finance context. I'm not going to discuss them all, that would send you off to sleep, but let's concentrate on the most important ones. First of all, the facilities agreement will make direct references to the other agreements in the transaction, in the Bible, the transaction Bible, to signal that these agreements collectively form the deal that was agreed. Importantly, the offtake agreement will be referenced. This secures the revenue rights for the project company and it is therefore an important security for the lender. The rights of the offtake agreement will be assigned to the lender. That means that they are signed over to him as security in case the project company defaults. There will be an elaborate set of preconditions that the project company needs to fulfill before it can draw down the loan. These are called the conditions precedent, and their purpose is to make sure that all the necessary arrangements have been put in place before you can draw down the loan. For example, the issuance of the necessary permits will be very important because you don't want the project earnings to be held up by a delay in permitting. The agreement will define a minimum level of debt service cover ratio. Remember that this ratio tracks the free cash flows that are available for debt service, the CADS, and that is more than the cash flow that is needed to service the project loans. If the DSCR should drop below the agreed level, for example due to higher costs or lower revenues, the loan becomes a riskier one for the lender, and then the facilities agreement usually provides that the lender may step up the interest or step in to protect its rights. This reflects the increase in the lending risk. Project revenues may be irregular. We may have no regulars for a few years because we still need to construct the project asset, and then we may see growing revenues while the operations are ramping up. And then the returns may start to develop more regularly, growing with increased use or with inflation. Ideally, we want the loan service, that is the interest and loan repayments, to track the incoming cash flows. In project finance, it is normal to adjust the loan repayment terms to match the net cash flows. We call this debt sculpting. For example, there may be a grace period during the construction phase, a period when no loan repayments are yet due. Conversely, if the loan is considered relatively risky, the banks may require what's called a cash sweep. That means that all the excess cash that is generated will be used immediately to repay the project loans down to an agreed safer level. A final specific feature I want to mention is the settlement of the cash flows. In project finance, the lender does not want to leave it to chance that the project company does the right thing and uses the cash flows to repay the loans. Payments are, again, highly scripted. The project company will be required to open bank accounts at the lender's bank, through which the cash flows are required to run, both inflows and outflows. These are called project accounts. The bank controls the in and outflows and can monitor that everything is going according to the plan. Requested payments, for example, for settling the EPC or O&M invoices, must be documented by the closing contracts before they can be released. There is also an agreed sequence that all payments must follow, the so-called waterfall or payment cascade. With all the revenues that come in, first, all the operating expenses must be settled. This makes sense because all parties want the project to continue and the revenues will depend on that. Second, we create reserve accounts for future operational costs. This ensures that the operations can continue even if the revenues are at some stage interrupted. Then, the interest and loan repayments on the project loans are settled. Remember that the lenders have priority rights on the cash flows over the equity investors. And finally, whatever funds are left after all these steps may be distributed to the equity investors as dividends. So they are the last in line. But if all goes according to plan, they will still earn a healthy return. All in all, these are quite complicated provisions that are favourable for the project lenders and often rather cumbersome for the project company. If you've worked on projects, you may have found that you faced such terms dictated by the project lenders and that you considered them unfair or a nuisance. Lenders do tend to get involved in construction issues and operational issues more often in project finance. But the project company is normally rewarded for bearing with their demands by relatively cheap funding and often at relatively high proportions of debt over equity. Loans of well over 70% of the total investment are quite common in project finance. We started off this course seeing that banks usually require a larger proportion of risk-bearing equity. The favourable loan terms in the facility agreement are possible only because of all the risk mitigation measures that we have applied as lender.